Hello everybody, welcome back to the book log. Today I'm going to be talking about Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA by Tim Weiner. I think this video is going to make me go crazy. I don't even know how to approach talking about this book, honestly. It's incredibly information dense. It covers so much ground. It overviews so many different events and people over the course of a really long period of time. This is ostensibly a book about the history of the CIA, but in a lot of ways it's sort of like a history of the United States from the end of World War II onwards. Of course, largely through the lens of the USA's foreign policy, but in order to talk about the CIA in this way, you need to be thorough, and it really needs to give a broad overview of general historical happenings of the time. I am mainly interested in talking about the various things the CIA got up to, but I think it's important to mention off the top that this is written from the perspective of one guy, the author, Tim Weiner. I think that Tim is pretty impartial. A lot of people criticize this book for being too hard on the CIA, but based on what I read and what I understand, I think I actually sort of have the opposite sentiments. Like, in spite of the torrent of literal war crimes described throughout this book, Tim Weiner still generally believes in the vision of the CIA and that it has the capacity to hypothetically be a benevolent organization that is capable of doing good things. I actually have somewhat mixed feelings about Tim Weiner's perspective on some of this stuff, but I'll touch on that later because it becomes more apparent near the end of the book. And for the record, the information in this book is based entirely on first-person testimony from CIA officers and policymakers, as well as thousands of pages of official, declassified government documents. It's one of the most rigorously sourced and verifiable histories of the agency available. In fact, for this very reason, a lot of people say it's a sort of limited hangout situation. I'm going to start from the beginning and just walk through the history of the CIA as it's portrayed in this book, who the major players are, and what sorts of things the CIA was doing during each presidency. I thought president by president could be an interesting idea, even though the individual focus each president gets in this book varies quite a bit. So yeah, this book starts at the very inception of the Central Intelligence Agency, which grew out of the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS. The OSS was created during World War II under Franklin Roosevelt. It was led by Wild Bill Donovan, and it was the United States' first organized foreign intelligence service. Its goal was to gather intelligence and run covert operations against the Axis powers. When FDR died in 1945, Harry Truman, who was deeply suspicious of the idea of secret intelligence organizations in general, dismantled the OSS. But a couple years later, as the Cold War began to take shape, Truman eventually capitulated to pressure and authorized the creation of a new peacetime spy agency. He did so through the National Security Act of 1947, which officially established the CIA. Again, apparently Truman was not into the idea of globe-spanning covert operations. He basically just wanted a news digest service to summarize intelligence reports for him. Tim Weiner argues that from the very beginning, the CIA was kind of directionless, had a vague mission, and just wasn't very well coordinated on a broad level. This is where we meet Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner. Unlike Harry Truman, these guys were very interested in covert action. Dulles was a kind of suave Wall Street lawyer who would later become CIA director for many years, and Frank Wisner, who was basically a raging psycho, built much of the CIA's clandestine services. This is where we get the sense of Tim Weiner's underlying notions of the CIA, which are that beyond anything else, they were mainly just very incompetent. The earliest covert operations in Eastern Europe led to disaster after disaster after disaster, with American agents constantly getting captured and imprisoned and executed by Soviet and other satellite state forces. From the very beginning, the agency's overriding mission was to fight communism, which I think is a fact that explains many of the questionable measures it pursued in the decades ahead. At this point in time, a few important things are happening. One, the Korean War, which was a Cold War proxy war pitting Soviet and China-backed North Korea against US-backed South Korea. Despite its enormous budget and thousands of employees, Tim Weiner notes that the CIA failed miserably at producing any accurate intelligence on the Soviets or the Chinese and their intentions. At this point, he also briefly mentions Project Artichoke and Project Ultra, which later was rolled into MK Ultra, where the CIA pursued mind control experiments and drug testing and began their long-standing tradition of torturing prisoners, and then also the recruiting and hiring of tons of Nazis. And not in a figurative, inflammatory way, but literally the CIA hired large numbers of former Nazi officials and intelligence officers because, Nazis were famously very against socialists. No one hated the socialists quite like the Nazis, and the CIA really got along with them on that particular point. The next president in the lineup is Dwight D. Eisenhower, and this is where the CIA really starts ramping up covert operations. The agency's director at the time was Walter Beadle Smith, who was a bit more of a professional and disciplined figure than a lot of other CIA guys, but he still presided over some pretty absurd CIA activities. Very much still behind the reins of actual power within the CIA at this time are Allen Dulles again and his brother, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who together shaped much of Eisenhower's foreign policy. The Dulles brothers were very enthusiastic about the idea of regime change and making sure that as many countries in the world as possible were aligned with U.S. interests. And if that meant toppling your democratically elected government and installing a brutal dictator, then so be it. One of the first and most famous examples of this was Operation Ajax in Iran, which was possibly the CIA's first major covert success. In 1953, Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, sought to nationalize the country's oil industry, which deeply upset the British, who had at that point controlled Iranian oil via the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. When Iran suggested then perhaps doing like a 50-50 split on the oil profits, Britain appealed to the US to instead just overthrow their government. The CIA poured millions of dollars into bribes, creating and distributing propaganda, literally hiring mobs and provocateurs to create or at least exacerbate street protests, all under the guise of preventing a communist takeover. The reality, of course, was about protecting Western oil interests and expanding U.S. influence in the Middle East. Mossadegh was overthrown, and the pro-Western Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was not really installed per se because he was already there, but changed from more of a figurehead monarch into the actual political leader of the country, who was very okay with cooperating with the US oil interests in exchange for lots of money and military aid. It turns out that this sort of thing, pumping millions and millions of tax dollars secretly without the knowledge or authorization of Congress into influencing popular politics abroad, was an incredibly common occurrence. I could not possibly discuss all of the instances of this. There are genuinely too many, but I'll at least talk about the ones that this book dedicated a lot of time to. Another very famous example was in 1954. Fresh off its coup in Iran, the Eisenhower administration and the Dulles brothers turned to Guatemala, where President Jacobo Arbenz's pretty modest land reform ideas were threatening the US-based United Fruit Company, and then were cast in Washington as evidence of, communist infiltration or whatever. Arbenz was like, hey, what if we take the huge plantations where foreign companies are sitting on millions of acres of idle land and give some of that unused land to the peasants who don't own any? And in response, the CIA launched Operation PB Success, where they armed a small rebel force led by Carlos Castillo Armas and orchestrated a massive psychological warfare campaign that included air raids, fake radio broadcasts, propaganda leaflets, staged acts of terror and assassination lists. And confronted with this totally manufactured crisis, Arbenz resigned and CIA-backed Castillo Armas seized power. This was publicly hailed as a popular revolt against communism, but in reality it was a coup that replaced Guatemala's democracy with decades of US-backed authoritarian regimes filled with death squads and civil war that was devastating to Guatemala's stability for years to come. This type of thing happened several more times under Eisenhower in places like the Congo, helping remove and eventually assassinate Patrice Lumumba while backing dictator Mobutu. Indonesia, where they actually failed a coup in 1958 but later made alliances with the generals who would go on to do the Indonesian genocide of 1965 and 1966, Syria, Laos, Dominican Republic, Vietnam. Each case followed basically the same playbook of propaganda, covert funding, arming rebels, propping up authoritarian allies, etc., always justified in the name of fighting communism, but usually at the cost of the democracy and stability of these countries. Eisenhower's presidency ended with the embarrassing U-2 spy plane debacle, where he got caught lying red-handed about spying on the Soviets after Gary Powers' plane got shot down. And then the book transitions into John F. Kennedy, whose presidency is described largely as a continuation of many of these same things. This book in no way entertains any CIA conspiracy theories relating to JFK or his assassination. It is primarily focused on Cuba, which was the big US foreign policy white whale at the time. First, there was the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Cuba was doing socialism, so the CIA and JFK thought it a convenient time to overthrow their government / Fidel Castro. The CIA trained and armed a group of about 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade and start an uprising against Castro, but it was a total disaster. Castro's forces completely crushed them within days. The exiles were all killed or captured, and the whole thing was almost immediately exposed as a US plot. This was extremely embarrassing for John F. Kennedy and led him to start distrusting the CIA as an institution, and it also led him to force Allen Dulles to resign in favor of the more establishment John McCone. No need to read into any of that, I'm sure. A year later came the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when US surveillance revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, which was just a generally tense moment for the agency and for America. The book gets a little bit into some of the ridiculous Tom and Jerry style assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, which was an effort largely fronted by Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Bill Harvey, codenamed Operation Mongoose. They tried sneaking Castro poisoned cigars, having him use a poisoned ballpoint pen, have him wear a poisoned wetsuit, get him near artificial exploding seashells. At one point, Bill Harvey contracted literal Italian mobsters to try to poison Castro's food and drink, all of course financed by the American tax dollar, and all were failures. Like I mentioned, this book spends essentially no time discussing the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's mentioned briefly, and then the book just moves swiftly along into the era of Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, as it relates to the CIA, as it's laid out in this book, essentially boils down to the Vietnam War. It'd be impossible to untangle all of this here in this review. It's barely even untangled in the book itself, but the gist of it is that the US was fighting to prevent South Vietnam from falling under communist control. The classic Cold War domino theory about how one communist country would inevitably domino into multiple others, blah, blah, blah. One of the key turning points in the whole war came with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where reports of a second North Vietnamese attack on US ships were essentially totally fabricated. This phony crisis was used by Johnson to push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which basically gave him a blank check to massively escalate the war. And while the war itself expanded into this massive, destructive US military commitment, the CIA's role shifted from intelligence gathering to direct counterinsurgency and paramilitary operations in Vietnam. The book talks about the Phoenix program, which was a CIA initiative to identify, capture, and kill members of the Viet Cong. They ran interrogation centers, they organized provincial counter-terror teams, they compiled blacklists, but in practice, thousands of suspects were arrested, detained without trial, tortured by electrocution, starvation, beatings, waterboardings, a lot of sexual assault, or they were just executed. Apparently around 20,000 Viet Cong suspects were killed under Phoenix, with many more imprisoned, a large percentage of which were innocent civilians or political opponents misidentified as insurgents. It's honestly an extremely depressing topic, and I think Tim Weiner does do a good job of showing how far the CIA was willing to go in the name of defeating communism, whatever that meant to them. For example, the CIA under Johnson was very close with apartheid South Africa and actually directly told South African security services where to find and arrest Nelson Mandela. During this time, LBJ first appointed Admiral William Rayborn as Director of Central Intelligence, but he very quickly floundered, and then Richard Helms came into the fold, who would go on to be one of the longest tenured DCIs ever behind Allen Dulles. Even though Helms oversaw the CIA as it drifted further into paramilitary activity, in this book he's described basically as a loyal bureaucrat who spent a lot of time cooking the books, so to speak, with regards to how the US was doing in Vietnam, aka getting their asses kicked, which definitely prolonged the conflict. LBJ was also the first president to introduce systematic domestic spying on American citizens, directing the CIA to monitor anti-war activists and civil rights leaders under the pretext of searching for communist influence. After this, we get everyone's favorite president, Richard Nixon. Interestingly enough, Nixon always distrusted and disliked the CIA, not because he disapproved of their actions, but because he thought the agency was filled with Ivy League liberals who weren't loyal to him, so he kept them at arm's length and relied primarily on his national security advisor, later also Secretary of State Henry Kissinger for foreign policy. Still though, Nixon did make full use of the CIA's covert action toolkit. One of the biggest stories in this section is Chile. In 1970, Salvador Allende, a socialist, was democratically elected president. Nixon and Kissinger, of course, saw this as unacceptable in America's backyard. Their first coup attempt actually failed when they kidnapped and killed Chilean general and army commander-in-chief René Schneider, which created a scandal that strengthened Allende's popular support instead of hurting it. After that, Nixon personally ordered the CIA to, quote-unquote, make the economy scream and prevent Allende from taking office by funneling millions of dollars into supporting trucker strikes, disrupting supply lines, and pressuring international banks to cut off loans in order to manufacture shortages and inflation and public unrest. They gave millions of dollars to Chilean media outlets to run relentless anti-Allende propaganda. The CIA spent the next 3 years undermining Allende's government until he was finally overthrown in a violent coup in 1973 and replaced by General Augusto Pinochet's brutal US-backed military dictatorship, who would go on to be responsible for the systematic torture and mass killings of thousands of innocent Chilean civilians. The book also briefly notes the CIA's role in the very bloody 1974 partition of Cyprus, where the agency had long propped up the Greek military junta and funneled money to right-wing factions on the island, who then staged a coup against Cypriot President Archbishop Makarios. This move pretty much immediately triggered Turkey's invasion and caused a bloodbath that left thousands dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. At the same time as all this, Nixon leaned on the CIA for more domestic reasons as well. This book touches on the Watergate scandal, where in 1972, a group of operatives with CIA backgrounds broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters to plant bugs and steal documents for Nixon's re-election campaign. When the FBI began investigating, Nixon tried to rope the CIA into the cover-up by having it falsely claim the matter touched on national security. The fallout to this led to Nixon firing Richard Helms and then, of course, resigning himself, but not before Richard Helms destroyed thousands of files. After this, we get President Gerald Ford. The CIA was in a bit of a tough spot at this point in history, at least in terms of public perception after Vietnam and Watergate, and it only got worse after the Church Committee investigations, which took place in 1975. Basically, Congress uncovered a laundry list of abuses, some of the same ones I've already mentioned, such as their various plots to assassinate foreign leaders, their secret mind control and drug experiments using LSD and other chemicals on unsuspecting subjects in MKUltra, just general widespread coups, propaganda campaigns, funding of foreign dictatorships, their domestic spying program like Operation Chaos, which illegally collected files on U.S. citizens, anti-war activists, civil rights groups, even Martin Luther King Jr. Tim Weiner actually has a different book on the FBI, which I'm sure has some interesting things to say about him. These revelations apparently shocked the public and shredded the CIA's reputation, so in response, Ford carried out the so-called Halloween Massacre, where he fired tons of intelligence leadership, including replacing his original DCI Bill Colby and replacing him with future president George Herbert Walker Bush. And this is not a credit to Ford. He very much did not want this information to be made public. He originally created the Rockefeller Commission, staffed it exclusively with his right-wing supporters, and essentially forced it to paint a very whitewashed picture of CIA activity before the Church Committee publicized a lot of the actual truth. So as a result of the prior decade or so, when Jimmy Carter came into the presidency in 1977, the CIA was at a low point. Carter appointed Admiral Stansfield Turner as CIA director, who was a Navy outsider who brought in his own people, pretty much gutted the entire clandestine service, and focused more on technical intelligence like satellites and stuff. This only deepened resentment inside the CIA, where a lot of career officers saw Turner as hostile to their traditions. The first main event this section of the book focuses on is the Iran hostage crisis, which came after the fall of the Shah, America's closest ally in the Middle East, and the Iranian Revolution, both of which blindsided the CIA. Iranian students seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage, where they were not released until the exact day Jimmy Carter was no longer president, deliberately to humiliate him for having backed the Shah for years, which was true of every president up until this point, and would have been true for future ones as well, but whatever. The other main thing that came out of this section was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which was followed by the CIA channeling arms and money to the Afghan Mujahideen, which was a broad mix of Afghan guerrilla groups. This covert aid program was pretty modest under Carter, but laid the foundation for the much larger Reagan-era operation that was supposed to give the Soviets their own Vietnam. This book probably spends less time time talking about Jimmy Carter than any other president, probably because he was the president that most sidelined the CIA, likely in part due to its low reputation and standing at the time. But that all changes once everyone's favorite president, Ronald Reagan, comes into office, and the CIA suddenly goes from being kind of on the defensive to enjoying a full-blown revival. Under Reagan's new CIA director, William Casey, the agency was given enormous freedom and funding to ramp up covert operations all over the globe. The Cold War at this time was framed in very moral, like almost biblical terms, and the CIA became Reagan's sword arm. In this book, there's a lot of focus on the Iran-Contra affair, which I'll try to explain as efficiently as I can, although again, it's like a very complicated thing to untangle. In Nicaragua, a democratically elected leftist government, the Sandinistas, had come to power in 1979 after overthrowing the US-backed Somoza dictatorship. To stop them from doing this, the CIA built up the Contras, who were a loose coalition of right-wing militias, many made up of Somoza's former National Guard, who carried out a brutal campaign of assassinations, massacres, and bombings of civilian infrastructure, like Nicaraguan ports and fuel depots. Congress actually tried to cut off US aid, but William Casey and the White House kept the war going anyway. The workaround was to secretly sell weapons to Iran, which at the time was under sanctions and accused of backing militant groups that had taken American hostages in Lebanon. The arms sales were justified as a way to ransom those hostages, but in practice, every payment only incentivized more hostage-taking. Anyway, profits from the sales were then funneled back to the Contras, all behind Congress's back. Reagan, of course, lied and denied it all until it blew up into this huge scandal. Tim Weiner describes the whole laundering scheme as the money machine, where the Pentagon provided the weapons, the CIA was the middleman, Iran paid for the weapons, then the CIA secretly diverted profits to the Contras. Funnily enough, reimbursement checks were deliberately written for exactly $999,999, right under the threshold that would have forced them to notify Congress. Like I said, this is sort of the main Reagan activity detailed in this book, but there were others too. At the same time, the CIA was also channeling millions into other fascist regimes and death squads in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre in Lebanon, where US-funded Maronite militias entered Palestinian refugee camps after the Israeli invasion and killed hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians while Israeli forces surrounded the area and let it happen. Just countless examples of how our tax money through the CIA is used to fund and underwrite atrocities across the world in the name of anti-communism. The Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, and from this point, as Tim Weiner points out, the CIA became a bit directionless. For decades, the agency had defined itself by this singular, almost supernatural enemy, global communism in the Soviet Union, and suddenly that psychological motivating force was gone. The entire purpose of the CIA had been to undermine the Soviets, and now they no longer existed. It's in this atmosphere that the presidency of George H.W. Bush begins, himself a former CIA director, but ironically, at a time when the agency was struggling to justify its own existence. The Cold War technically ended on his watch, and that marked the end of the CIA's supposed decades-long mission and purpose to study Moscow. As far as Tim Weiner describes it, George H.W. Bush really didn't utilize the CIA that much during his presidency, which is again surprising given his history within the institution. William Webster was the DCI for most of his term, but he doesn't come across as especially bold or transformative either. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, launching the Gulf War, the US military and Defense Department took the lead in gathering intelligence with satellites and precision targeting and other technological machinery, which heavily shifted the balance of power toward the Pentagon and away from the CIA. Now that communism wasn't this supernatural threat to democracy anymore, the CIA was kind of struggling to redefine its mission, and on top of that, they had gone through about a dozen huge public scandals at this point, which was hurting them reputationally. Not that the CIA stopped doing damage and supporting atrocities and whatnot. In 1989, the US invaded Panama to oust Manuel Noriega, a dictator who was actually a longtime CIA asset who had been on the agency's payroll for years. The invasion, Operation Just Cause, left thousands of Panamanians dead and exposed the contradiction of Washington propping up Noriega until he became an embarrassment and then having to overthrow their own asset. Another one was during the Gulf War in 1991. U.S. bombers struck the Amaria air raid shelter in Baghdad, which was a civilian shelter misidentified as a military command post, killing an estimated 1,200 civilians, mostly women and children. In the book, this is painted largely as incompetence, but at this point, who could know? That leads into Bill Clinton's presidency, where the CIA's problems only deepened, with the Cold War still still over. The agency tried to reinvent itself around counterterrorism, but Tim Weiner makes clear that it was consistently a step behind, as usual. For the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, several of the terrorists had entered the country multiple times with U.S. approval, despite being on watch lists. In Somalia, the CIA misread the situation so badly that the U.S. mission collapsed after the Black Hawk Down debacle in 1993, with 18 Americans and over 1,000 Somalis killed. In Haiti, the agency funneled money to the junta that had ousted democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, putting actual CIA paid informants in power until U.S. forces restored him under heavy international pressure. The U.S.-backed junta, of course, brutalized and killed tons of civilians, but you could probably figure that out at this point. In Yugoslavia, CIA targeting errors contributed to the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, which killed 3 journalists and enraged Beijing. All the while, the agency struggled to get a handle on Osama bin Laden, who was steadily building al-Qaeda's global network and was a well-known figure to U.S. intelligence at the time, and that fits nicely into the final administration that is covered in this book, that of George W. Bush. This section, as you might imagine, primarily deals with 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror. Tim Weiner strongly insinuates that the CIA specifically failed to prevent 9/11, despite having fragments of intelligence on the hijackers in the months beforehand. After the attacks, Bush handed the CIA a central role in the new war on terror, and it pretty much ran wild like in the good old days. This meant extraordinary rendition, kidnapping suspects and flying them to random countries to be tortured, black sites, which are secret prisons across Eastern Europe and the Middle East and Asia, and of course, systematic torture programs that included waterboarding, beatings, sleep deprivation, and even prisoners literally tortured to death. In Afghanistan, the CIA presided over airstrikes and raids that killed thousands of civilians, with families sometimes receiving up to $1,000 payouts as compensation for the loss of loved ones. Great quote in here by David Petraeus, who would go on to be the head of the CIA under Obama. Every army of liberation has a half-life, beyond which it turns into an army of occupation. The agency's failures were possibly even worse in Iraq, which, as Weiner emphasizes, had pretty much nothing to do with the planning or orchestration of 9/11. The CIA produced the faulty intelligence on weapons of mass destruction that gave Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld their pretext for invasion in 2003. Once inside Iraq, the CIA oversaw interrogations that resulted in more detainees being tortured to death, while U.S. forces killed tens of thousands of civilians in a war that just spiraled into chaos. Alongside the CIA, the book notes how private contractors like Blackwater started to become more utilized and also acted with total impunity. This particular case is not mentioned in the book, as it happened around the same time as its publication, but infamously in 2007, Blackwater guards killed 17 Iraqi civilians, including women and children, in Nisour Square. And to circle it back to the president, the perpetrators of this massacre were pardoned by Donald Trump in 2020. There's obviously so much more you could talk about. I'm really only scratching the surface here. This book is like 600 pages. One thing I want to mention is that towards the end of the book, I began to understand some of the ideological criticisms levied towards it and toward Tim Weiner as an author. For instance, this book takes a strangely derisive tone against Bill Clinton's indifference towards fully utilizing the CIA's capabilities. Tim Weiner was an active journalist during his administration, so I'm sure his proximity to a lot of the stuff contributes here, but sometimes I found it hard to square his thoughts on the general mission of the CIA. He spends literally hundreds of pages meticulously detailing all of these war crimes planned or supported or funded or straight up committed by the CIA. And yet his ultimate conclusion is somehow that this is a benevolent institution that is theoretically capable of doing good, but has just been mired down by misuse and incompetence. I guess I read this stuff and just come away with a much more negative opinion of these guys based on Tim's own retelling of events. I found it strange how he came to such ultimately different conclusions, but I'll digress on that. All in all, this book is incredibly detailed, meticulously researched, very dense, very informative, and above all else, completely depressing in every way. Probably works better as a reference text than a book to sit down and read cover to cover, but it'll be available to anyone who desires to inflict psychic damage on themselves. I'm just gonna give it like a 7.5.